The sins of the fathers rest heavily on the Turks, because some 150 years after the establishment of the first Göktürk Empire of Büyümen and İstemir, the largest steppe empire in history up to that point, their descendants do not live in independence nor in dignity. The once wise Khagans of the Ashina dynasty were followed by bad Khagans who sold their homeland without hesitation to foreign rulers in order to maintain their own authority. The dynasty broke apart, and although some members in the West and the East did their best to hold the empire together, an era of oppression followed. Some Ashina resisted the occupants by military force. These brave resistance fighters were betrayed by their own relatives who submitted to the Chinese, maintained the oppression of the Turks, and were rewarded with a comfortable life in luxury. But even in the darkest hour, there is always a glimmer of hope. A light that leads the Turks out of the cave into which they have been forced to flee. Someone who is neither corrupt nor an opportunist. A man who submits only to Tengri and in whose name he will lead his people into freedom. That man is Iltutmish. Within a short time, he turns his back on the Chinese and gathers all of the oppressed Turkic tribes for a covert uprising. He trades a life of luxury for a life of dignity. Because of his integrity and charisma, the tribes pledge their allegiance to him. With combined strength, the Turks successfully go into battle against the Chinese for the first time in 50 years. Iltutmish thus manages to establish the Second Göktürk Empire in 681 AD. The days of these celestial Turks may be long gone. Nevertheless, it is of utmost importance, especially for the people of the modern Turkic republics, to learn and understand their history. After all, only those who know their past can determine their future. The story of the Göktürks is one of expulsion, flight, and spectacular comeback. According to legend, the last survivor of a tribe had been placed in a cave to find protection from the invaders of his hometown and the murderers of his family. This boy was nourished and raised by an adult fused with a she-wolf. The pregnant she-wolf gave birth to 10 children, all half wolf and half human, who also grew into strong men. With the help of a mighty hammer, the 10 men cleared a path through the mountain range in which they had been hidden to the outside and entered the villages around them. Each of them took a wife from the other tribes, and in course of time they multiplied. One of the men took the surname Asena after the she-wolf who had given birth to him. Both the legend of Asena and the legend of Ergenekon illustrate the birth of the Asena family, who later became known as Turk. Their headquarters were in the Altai Mountains. Here lies the heart of ancient Turkic culture. Surrounded by the Sayan Mountains in the north, the Altai region consists of beautiful landscapes, rivers, lakes, valleys, and green meadows abound. But when the Asena family grew bigger and more powerful, they left this area because they became rulers of the Göktürk Empire. The Göktürks were a Eurasian nomadic people of late antiquity who had created the transcontinental steppe empire of Eurasia. This means that they ruled over most of the so-called steppe belt from Korea to Ukraine, but did not live in cities themselves, at least not continuously. The term Göktürk means something like heavenly, blue, eastern, and original Turks. All these characteristics apply to the Asena, the ruling dynasty of the empire. Incidentally, the Chinese called them Ashina. They were a clan of at least 500 families who had fled from Mongolia to the Turfan Basin in ancient times after the collapse of the Xiongnu Hunnic Empire. When a Chinese army invaded their town and devastated the area, they migrated again, arriving in the Altai in northern Central Asia in the 5th century. The tale of Asina, inspiration for the Turkish wolf hand gesture, tells of this flight in mythical form. But in any case, within the Altai mountain range, the Ashina had been protected from outside invasions. In the course of the following century, they became excellent blacksmiths and very skilled in horse archery. But as a result of their flight, they had become subjects of the powerful Rouran Empire. The Ashina were Turkic as they spoke the Old Turkic language, cultivated Old Turkic traditions, and believed in the god of the Turks, Tengri. At that time, their neighborhood was filled with people from different cultural spheres, but the most prominent was that of the Turkic peoples. Accordingly, the Ashina represented only one of many Turkic tribes. Despite being in the majority, however, the other Turks could not hold their own against the Rouran, whose dynasty was most likely of Mongol origin, albeit influenced by Turkic culture. But suddenly in 552, Bumin, as fifth-generation Ashina leader, managed to defeat the Rouran ruler and destroy his empire. However, not in a literal sense, as Bumin took over the administrative structures of the Rouran Khaganate. He appointed himself Kagan, the great king of the steppe, founded the state of the Turk. We call this state Göktürk to distinguish it from the numerous other Turkic states in history. And to the same extent, we call the ruling dynasty Ashina, so as not to confuse it with the she-wolf Asina. From then on, his family ruled over most of the steppe. His brother Isdemir expanded the territory westwards to the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus, integrating the Sogdians into the empire. This merchant nation, in turn, with the help of the Göktürks, extended their trade and influence along the Silk Road to Byzantium, with which the Turks had formed an alliance with against Persia. The Turks invested in the infrastructure of numerous cities along the Silk Road. The Byzantine diplomat Zimarchus noted in his documents that he had seen marble statues in the cities of the Turks that were in no way inferior to Roman art. In the east, Bumin's son Muhan honored his father's alliance and, with the Zhou dynasty, attacked the Qi dynasty that had harbored Rouran refugees, the former enslavers of the Ashina. In addition, the Göktürks formed a secret alliance with the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo to keep China at bay. During this period, some Turkic tribes had also migrated from their heartland, unintentionally extended the influence of Turkic culture into the Caucasus, Afghanistan, and Tibet. It seemed as if Bumin's successors had cemented the power of the Ashina dynasty, but the Turkic golden era was rapidly coming to an end. Impatient, greedy 7th-generation Turkic princes were incited to fratricide by Chinese agents. The empire was halved into two parts after a devastating civil war. Despite a final sweep by Tong Yabgu and Ilig Khan, the great last kings of the West and East respectively, the entire Göktürk territory was annexed by China between 630 and 657. The new Tang dynasty had reunited China after 400 years of turmoil and made real the revenge of their predecessors against barbarian nomads of the north and east. Thousands of Ashina Turks were forcibly resettled in northern China, while the other Turkic peoples came under Chinese rule in so-called protectorates. Numerous Turkic rebellions failed, including that of a certain Khorshad, who had almost managed to personally assassinate Tang Emperor Taizong. After the conquest of Central Asia, Taizong, the second emperor of the Tang dynasty, had ordered the resettlement of the Ashina Turks to northern China. Taizong, whose personal name was Li Shimin, had resorted to two ingenious strategies against the Göktürks. First, ally with the far against the near. Although the Göktürk civil war had ended in 603, the rulers in the west and east remained suspicious of one another. Taizong, like some of his predecessors, drew the Western Turks closer to China through political, dynastic marriage and economic relations in order to ward off attacks from the Eastern Turks. After the invasion of Ilik Khan in the 620s, however, and after Taizong's coup against his own father, the new emperor ordered a new foreign policy against the Gökturks. He now allied himself with other Turkic groups such as the Dokuz Oğuz, who later became known as the Uyghurs and the Si Tardush. The latter helped Taizong overthrow Ilik Khan, and as successors ruled over the former Eastern Empire of the Gökturks on friendly terms with the Chinese, of course. When the Sir Tardush became too powerful, Taizong's armies took up arms and subjugated all of Mongolia. But while still at war with the Sir Tardush, the Chinese also attacked the Tarim Bazin, and with it the most important Silk Road trading cities, which until then had been under Göktürk protection. Taizong's plan was particularly perfidious. He used former Göktürk princes that had been resettled from Mongolia to China as generals of the Chinese army. The Western Turks, who were still politically independent, therefore fought several battles of their own relatives from the east for control of the Tarim Basin by the Chinese. After the Tang dynasty had subjugated both the Sir Tardush and the Tarim Basin, Chinese armies attacked the Western Turks and advanced as far as Talas in present-day Kyrgyzstan. And so, by 657, the Gökturks were in complete political captivity of the Chinese. But this captivity is to be understood literally, because Taizong's second strategy was even more important than the first: divide and rule. Due to the geographic dispersion of the Ashina dynasty all over Eurasia, the Gökturks could not organize for large-scale rebellion. Moreover, there was little contact between the Ashina Turks in northern China and the other Turkic ruling dynasties. In the meantime, the Turkic families, who had once been minor rulers within Göktürk dominion, had established their own states. The Turk Shahi, for example, ruled from Kabul to the Pamir Mountains in the east and on the Indus River to the south, while the Tokhara Yabgus ruled the north of what is now Afghanistan, with their HQ being located in Kunduz. The Turks came into strong contact with the Bactrian, Iranian, and Indian cultures, and Manichaeism partly found its way into the court of their rulers. Further west, part of the Ashina dynasty had broken away and founded the states of the Khazars on the Caucasus.
We can begin to speak about the real Khazars, about actual Khazars, sometime in the 640s, 650s. The ethnonym Khazar and Turk is being interchanged, and there's a reason for that. It seems that the Khazars were an offshoot of the Western Turk state, and they were ruled by an Ashina dynasty. Our sources don't say that flat out, but all of the details that the Arabic sources give regarding Khazar customs and ceremonies and so on, like the installation of the Khagan, is identical to the material that the Chinese sources are giving about the Göktürks. And we know that the Arabs were not reading Chinese.
Other Turkic-speaking tribes had also founded new kingdoms, such as the Bulgars, ancestors of the Bulgarians, who had been neither Christianized nor Slavicized at this point. But most Turkic tribes, such as the Pecheneg, Kipchaks, Bashkirs, continued to live autonomously in the vastness of the Eurasian steppe, just as they had before the rise of the Gökturks. The Ashina dynasty in the east was on its own. Taizong had probably been a Turkophile and called himself Tengri Tek Khan of the Turks, meaning legitimized by Tengri. But his successors remained skeptical of the Turks. With each revolt of the Turks, this skepticism increased. Without further ado, the Turkic generals and officers were one by one dismissed by the Tang army, which in turn strengthened the Turks' desire for freedom. They finally wanted to retake control of their own destiny. The Turks' pride was too great for them to allow themselves to be assimilated. Even former Ashina members who had lived in Chinese cities for some time felt increasingly alienated. Attempts by Ashina princes like Inichor Boru and Bengu Shad to declare independence were quickly crushed, and the perpetrators executed by the Tang dynasty in the marketplace of Chang'an publicly. Long after Taizong's death, the Tang dynasty feared Turkic uprisings and resorted to increasingly brutal methods, and yet the Ashina did not give up.
The Turks in China at this time were a sizable number. They had worked with the Chinese government, the Tang dynasty's government, in many military capacities. When foreign groups were brought into China and put into this kind of loose reign system, the reality is that the success of that system really depended on the consent of the people being governed. That is, the Tang dynasty did not have a huge army that it could keep up there, control the Turks. It had to rely on their willingness to be part of the system. And in fact, because they were armed people, right? They were at times part of the Tang military. Eventually, the Turks' leadership decided that they were not benefiting from the system as it was, and they wanted to return to their former way of life. That is, to go back to Mongolia, to the steppe, and to be independent. It perhaps makes sense that the first few failed, in part because it was something new. They weren't sure how to do it. The Chinese did make efforts to stop them. They also made false promises to them. Quit rebelling, we won't punish you. And then they did punish them. For example, Punyan was promised that he wouldn't be punished, and then later he was put to death. They used whatever tricks they could to keep the Chinese under control, and that included breaking their promises.
Kutluk, the young nobleman of the Ashina family, dared another uprising. He had been the son of a Tudun, a Turkic governor of the steppe. Kutluk secretly gathered thousands of men and women for a revolt, but instead of heading west like Inichor Boru and Bengu Shad openly towards the old home on the Altai with a temporary headquarters on the flat and open steppe, Kutluk headed east with his army. In the Yin Mountains, the Turks were protected from revenge attacks by the Chinese. Kutluk planned a covert uprising, and for his gathered more local troops, they moved into Shaanxi province. In a total of perhaps a dozen campaigns, he was able to defeat the Chinese with a few exceptions, but his destination was actually the Altai, where the strongest Turkic tribes had dwelled. Kutluk began his campaign in 684 and within 3 years defeated the Dokuzos, the traitors who had overthrown Ilik Kagan 5 decades earlier. Then, Kutluk established his rule over the Altai regions. His 17 generals in total moved simultaneously to the north and south to convince the local tribes of Ashina rule. By crossing the Sayan Mountains victoriously, Kutluk defeated the Kyrgyz Turks and thus secured the entire north of the Eastern Göktürk Empire. At this point, the Chinese no longer had any political or military rule over said region. The new Second Göktürk Empire was born. Kutluk did not move his capital to the Altai, the former seat of Bumin and Istemir, but to Ötüken, a legendary forest town located somewhere along the Orkhon River, which flowed south from Lake Baikal. The exact location of Ötüken is secret. It is said that whoever ruled over Ötüken would be legitimized and empowered by Tengri to rule the entire steppe. Because of the forest in Ötüken emanates the Kut, a kind of energy that was invisible to the naked eye. The Kut only opens up to certain people who can handle it, and Ötüken only to those rulers who can provide their people with food and shelter. Kutluk had managed to do just that. He was probably a good ruler, therefore he could easily establish his headquarters in Ötüken, and being equipped with Kut, began his rule over the rest of the steppe. He also had a fitting name, Kutluk, meaning he who is endowed with Kut. If Kut is closely related to Tengri, the god of the Turks, Was Kutluk possibly chosen and driven by Tengri? The story of Kutluk and his followers is strongly influenced by the mystical elements of the old Turkic era, and especially by the propagandistic explanations of the Orkhon inscriptions. We know, however, that Kutluk had actually managed all of this without having to resort to political allies outside of the Turkic world. He had, however, had an important Turkic ally, Tonyukuk. This man was born on the Toul River in Mongolia and grew up in China. He served as overseer of Ashina Turks who had been settled in Tabgach. Tabgach was the Turkic name for northern China. And when he learned of Kutluk's plans, he joined his cause. Unlike the leader, Tonyukuk had grown up among the Chinese and was aware of Chinese traditions and mentalities. He was also aware of the differences between Turks and Chinese. This fact would later decisively shape the fate of the Gökturks. After the foundation of the empire in 681, Tonyukuk acted as general of the Gökturk army and defeated, among others, the Dokuz Oğuz, Kyrgyz, but also remnants of the Tsir Tardush in battle. He had made short work of the murderers of his ancestors. Kutluk is described in the Orkhon inscriptions as El Teresh. In Old Turkic, El means land, and the name he who gathered the land. In modern Turkish, El has become Il, which is why he is referred to as Il Teresh.
In world mythology, there is a kind of spread notion of a state founder who comes from very humble beginnings. You can see it in the foundation of Rome, you can see it in the foundation of some Chinese dynasties, you can see it in the foundation of the Mongols, and you can see it in the foundation of the Turks, with both Bumin and Kutluk Ilterish, that these are very common stories. That doesn't mean that they are wrong, completely wrong. Many people do get their beginnings in a small way. Enhancing the smallness of it and the difficulty of it does, as you say, kind of enhance the epicness.
In other words, Kutluk was the one who had gathered the Turks, the numerous tribes, many of whom who joined his cause quite voluntarily. Most Ashina Turks, moreover, had left China and lived in political independence and freedom in and around Öteken. Because even though Ilterish was the Khan, the absolute sovereign of the Gökturk Empire and legitimized as ruler of the entire steppe, he was not a dictator. The state structure of the Second Göktürk Empire is similar to that of the First Empire. Like Bumin, Ilterish was politically untouchable. He was imbued with Kut and legitimized by Tengri, but he was untouchable only as long as he was a good ruler. If the supply of the people in the Göktürk Empire was no longer guaranteed, or if the campaigns against the enemies ended in too many defeats, the prosperity and security of the citizens in the empire would be endangered, and thus the political stability would falter. Then by the people who would have the right to replace the Khagan by force. He was even allowed to be killed, but only being strangled, so that his noble, sacred blood would not be spilled. This was a tradition that was maintained in all Turkish dynasties, even in the Ottoman Empire. As much as the Turks believed in Tengri, they were fully aware of the political implications of the removability of the Khan. This stemmed from an ancient law taken from the old Turkic Töre. And Ilterish was even more aware of the fragility of his rule. He did not want to bring about disaster like some of his last Khans of the First Empire, but to increase and preserve the prosperity of his people. He was less concerned with protecting his own government and more with restoring the sovereignty of the Gökturks and all other Turkic peoples as well. However, the rule of the Ashina dynasty, who administered the empire with their numerous shads and tunes, was this time mainly supported by the wife of the Khan, Elbilge Hatun. She was the empress of the Gökturks and had fought for Turkic freedom alongside her husband. In fact, Elbilge and Ilterish worked very closely at a time when the Turkic world was still characterized by societal distrust and a desire for military revenge. The stability of the Second Göktürk Empire can be attributed to her. And she may have been an inspiration for the younger generation of women to take on more responsibility in politics again. In China, this had been rather unusual, and the strong role of Turkic women had been ridiculed by Chinese diplomats, scholars, and politicians alike. But the Turks were different from the Chinese. Here, the woman was equal to the man. While he mainly set the tone in battle, she called the shots at home. The Ashina family tree reveals the general political and personal constellation for the following decades. Ilterish and El-Bilge Hatun ruled as emperor and empress. Two of Ilterish's brothers, Bogu and Turuzbeg, were the top generals of the Göktürk army alongside Tönykük. His sons Bilge and Kül in turn became officers. However, when Ilterish died, Bilge and Kül had been 9 and 8 years old respectively, too young to rule. Therefore, Bogu succeeded Ilterish and hence therefore referred to as Kapgan. Because after a decade of new beginnings and stability, hard times were ahead. China, now under the rule of Empress Wu of the Zhou dynasty, was out for revenge. Empress Wu had secured her rule against all odds from the Tang dynasty and was preparing wars in Korea, the Tarim Basin, and Tibet. Meanwhile, the western front and eastern front of Göktürks had become restless. In the east, the Mongolic Khitan were striving for independence from the seemingly tyrannical Zhou. This, however, brought the tribe into the sights of the Turks as a pawn against the Chinese. In the west, the Turgesh was formed from remnants of the western Göktürks. Under Sakal Khan, they disputed the cities of the Tarim Basin with the Chinese and sought the help of the Ashina dynasty. In Öteken, Kapgan set out for battle, accompanied by Tönykük and tens of thousands of warriors. He was willing to fight to the death, while Kutluk was the one blessed by Kut. Kapgan was made for war. The meaning of his name? The Conqueror. The new Kagan carried on Ilterish's legacy. Within 25 years, Kapgan's warriors conquered much of the Eurasian steppe. The expansion of the Second Göktürk Empire took place almost exclusively in Western Asia. Historians agree that the Göktürks did not intend to conquer Chinese territory. Instead, annual raids on China are recorded, undertaken for purposes of demonstrating power, both against external and internal enemies. Because the forcibly subjugated Turkic tribes of Dokuz Oğuz, Sir Tardush, and Kyrgyz were just waiting to depose the Kagan at any moment of weakness and break away politically, under Kapgan, that moment did not happen, as he had an able entourage. Torzbay, brother of Ilterish and Kapgan, had been proclaimed Shad, governor, in the Ongi River after the proclamation of the Second Empire. It was to Torzbay's credit that Ilterish had defeated Dokuz Oğuz. Under Kapgan, he retained his title. Later, a monument was erected in his honor. In addition, Kapgan had established the title of Lower Kagan and bestowed it on his son Inel. He, in turn, led an army of 40,000 men in the west of the empire and clashed with the other tribes. The Chinese therefore called him Conqueror of the West. Kapgan himself was both brave and strong enough to continue his rule unchallenged, but he was also successful. This was demonstrated in a series of conflicts against the other nomadic peoples, but especially in the great conflict against China. An incident in eastern Mongolia attracted Kapgan's attention. The Mongolic Khitan had once intended to rush to the aid of the Chinese against the Turkic rebellion and stop Ilterish. At least that's what Tönykük, who had by then become chief of staff of the Göktürks, tells us. More than a decade later, however, the Khitan were caught in the favor of Kapgan and the Turks, and a proxy war was looming. In the meantime, a major transition of power had occurred in China. Gaozong died, but no one was allowed to visit him. Only his wife, the former concubine of Taozong, was present. This wife, who had married Gaozong for political reasons, delivered the will of the now deceased emperor to the envoy. In summary, it said, "Listen to my wife. It was this woman who held real authority in China. She demonstrably had great influence on Gaozong and had Li Hong, the crown prince, poisoned."
We have to remember that this is also the time when Empress Wu is becoming powerful. Her husband, who was incapacitated, he had had a stroke, the emperor, many years before, and so she was really running the government. And yet, as a woman, this was hard for her. She was very focused on internal politics. She still wanted to keep the Turks under control, but in her focus on her own power, she ended up removing people from office who were not her supporters. But this included at least one general who was very skilled in Turkic matters. And the sources even say that the Turks were pleased that he was fired. So this gave the Turks maybe an easier way of doing things.
After eliminating all other pretenders, she made herself Empress Wu Zetian of China in 690 and proclaimed the Zhou dynasty. Especially the first years of her reign were marked by the terror of a secret police. However, she turned out to be a capable ruler. She had a talent for putting the right people in the right positions. As a result, China's power continued to rise. She was as ambitious and self-confident as Kapgan, and that might be why the two rulers clashed. Kapgan continued the tradition of regular plundering in northern China. In 694, there was an almost direct confrontation with the Zhou army, but Kapgan withdrew his armies in time. However, only 2 years later, a rebellion broke out among the Mongol Khitan. Tribal leaders Li and Sun, who were brothers-in-law, complained about discrimination by Zhou official Zhao. When their complaints fell on deaf ears, they took up arms and Li appointed himself as Khan. Empress Wu sent troops out to put down the rebellion, but the Khitan fought back successfully. For unknown reasons, Li died. At that moment, Göktürk troops arrived in the settlement area of the Mongols. Kapgan attacked the Khitan headquarters and captured the families of Li and Sun. After the Turks withdrew, Sun now assumed the title of Khan and continued attacks on the Chinese, each time successfully. The Zhou dynasty was simultaneously attacked by the Göktürks, who were obviously playing a two-pronged game. Empress Wu came under pressure. She offered Kapgan truce on terms that could be described as humiliating for the Chinese side. Wu was forced to make massive concessions to end the Khitan rebellion. The Chinese sent hundreds of carts full of silk, seeds, tools, and iron to the Turks in Utuken. Accordingly, Kapgan did change his attitude as he stopped the Turkic attacks. Now, in the summer of 697, he attacked the Khitan again. Sun was killed in action and the Khitan collapsed. Empress Wu bestowed honorable titles on the Khagan, calling him the Khagan with good motives. Of course she did. He had saved the Chinese from military embarrassment. But now Kapgan saw himself in an elevated position and in the following year demanded a prince of the Tang dynasty to marry his daughter. Empress Wu's chancellor objected to this demand, saying, "In the past, no Chinese prince ever married a barbarian woman." Apparently, this chancellor had forgotten the story of Empress Ashina, the daughter of Göktürk ruler Mukhan, who had lived in Chang'an for 16 years and was treated with the utmost respect as an empress as well as an empress dowager. Wu prevailed upon her chancellor, demoted him to a mere prefect, and dispatched a prince of the Zhou dynasty. But Kapgan did not accept the prince from the Zhou at all, had the envoy killed, and went on to attack. Chinese sources claim that Kapgan had quite different intentions. By marrying his daughter to a prince of the Tang dynasty, he would help that prince to overthrow the Zhou dynasty and bring the Tang dynasty back to power in China. The following turmoil could have benefited the Gökturks geopolitically. This is a daring conspiracy theory, but Kapgan actually did launch a large-scale attack that resulted in more than just looting. He penetrated deep into the Hebei province. Some Chinese officers, who must have been unhappy with the Empress Wu, joined the Gökturks. Kapgan even appointed General Yan as the southern Khagan, with whose help he was able to conquer Zhao Hu and Ding Zhu. A general of the Zhou dynasty, Murong, also changed sides and joined the Turks with 5,000 soldiers. In August 698, the Turks destroyed the city of Dingzhou. Now, Empress Wu became so angry that she put a bounty on the Khagan's head. But Kapgan gave the order to retreat just in time. He had successfully created unrest in China while looting much valuable property. In the years that followed, the situation in East Asia remained tense. Empress Wu died, and her daughter-in-law and successor Empress Wei went full confrontation with the Gökturks. In 707, there was an all-important battle at Mingsha. A small army of barely 10,000 Turkic soldiers faced 80,000 Chinese of the Tang dynasty, which now ruled over China again. The Turkic army was led by Kapgan with his nephews Kultegin and Bilge as commanders who had grown up in the meantime. They were opposed by Chinese General Cha Cha. He had received help from the Dokuzos. In the inscription dedicated to Kultegin, his role was described as follows. During the battle, Kultegin rode first on a grey horse, then on another grey horse of Ishbara, and then on the Doru horses of Yin Sili Bey, and simultaneously continued to attack the Chinese. But all the horses were killed. The Chinese shot onto Kultegin more than 100 arrows, but the arrows did not touch his face nor his head. The son of Ilturish had made a name for himself in Mingsha and was already considered a legendary commander of the Gökturks. He was only 22 years old, and indeed, the Ashina dynasty was victorious. Cha Cha understood that he could not win and ordered to flee. It is said that 30,000 Chinese died that day, although this number sounds inflated. Once again, the Gökturks invaded China, plundered several provinces, captured 10,000 horses, and humiliated the Chinese. After this victory, peace reigned along the borders of the Turkic realm to the north and the Chinese realm to the south. The nomadic Kapgan had finally cemented his sovereignty over the sedentary Chinese. Could he have gone on and conquered Chinese territory, even permanently occupied it like Genghis Khan half a millennium later? Kapgan turned his attention to the western part of the Göktürk Khaganate. Meanwhile, the Turgesh tribe had taken power in West Central Asia. In a series of raids, the Turgesh attempted to wrest control of the Tarim Basin from the Chinese. Their Khan, Sakal, was quite successful but allowed himself to be placated into a truce by the Chinese. He was simultaneously engaged in stopping the Arab invasion from the west. During this period, Sogdian, Iranian, and Turkic tribes and city-states of West Central Asia were hostile to the invaders. Bars Beg, the Khan of the Kyrgyz, was under his liege Kapgan politically. He was also brother-in-law of Bilge Khan, but in secret he sent diplomats to Sakal to end his war against China, and instead put all his efforts into a triple entente between Kyrgyz, Turgesh, and Tang, their common enemy, the Gökturks. Tonyukuk got wind of this after Sakal's brother left the Turgesh and passed the plan on to Tonyukuk in the Göktürk Empire. In the winter of 710, Tonyukuk attacked the Kyrgyz. Barsbeg was killed. The Gökturks' raid is described by Tonyukuk as follows. After crossing the Aktermel River, I left the rear camp. I made my way through the snow, leading the horses at a walk and leaning on wooden sticks. While two soldiers mounted to the east, we crossed Ibarbasha. We went down the slope. We reached Togberry on the slope in 10 nights. We swam through the river, stopping several times. On the slope of the mountain, we walked at a trot that day and night. We shot arrows at the Kyrgyz and fought with their army. Their Khan gathered the army. We fought them and killed their Khan. The Kyrgyz people surrendered. In 711, Tonyukuk led an army of 20,000 men with Kultegin and Bilge Khan against Turgesh. The Battle of Bolcha is considered the most important military conflict of the Second Göktürk Empire. Near the Arungu River in present-day Xinjiang, Göktürks and Turgesh fought for 2 days. In the end, Tonyukuk's army was able to gain the upper hand. Both Sakal and his defected brother were executed. With a victory over the Turgesh, the tribal leaders of Western Central Asia gradually arrived at Tapgan's court and submitted to the Ashina dynasty. In a short time, the Göktürks conquered historical Turkestan. Their influence reached even the Iron Gate in Uzbekistan, near Samarkand. In 713, the Göktürks led by Kultegin were even able to subjugate the Karluks too. The dominance of the Göktürks were finally restored after a century of crises and conflicts, but it did not last for long. In 716, Kapgan died. His brother Turuz Beg usurped the title and appointed himself Inel Kagan. However, in doing so, he violated the natural succession laws of the Turks. Bilge was the rightful successor. Kultegin took an army and killed Inel Khan and all those who had sided with him. He put Bilge Khan on the throne and appointed himself Shad. Now he was the chief of staff of the Göktürks, while Tonyukuk assumed the role of political advisor. If Kapgan was the conqueror, Bilge was the preserver. Bilge is not his personal name, but like Ilterish and Kapgan, also a title and means wise. But Bilge was above all the keeper of unity. If his father Ilterish and his uncle had conquered all of the tribes of the steppe and quieted the sedentary neighbors, Bilge Khan had made enemies of them all. This was not due to his person. He came to power at the wrong time. Conquest is easier than domination, but perhaps he rose to Kagan at just the right time. For unlike Kapgan, Bilge was uncompromising throughout. Especially in the early years of his reign, he mercilessly enforced the prerogative of the Ashina dynasty and would not be appeased. Like father, like son. While in the west, the Tang dynasty had allied with the Karluks and other Turkic tribes to stop the Arab Umayyads, Tibetans and their allies from the Turgesh, the Göktürks were compromisingly preoccupied with other problems. Under the rule of Bilge Khan, whose real title was actually Bilge Kagan, the Second Göktürk Empire was at its height. However, the Ashina dynasty almost continuously busy putting down revolts by rebellious tribes. Bilge Khan therefore instituted reforms. Turkic tribes that had fled Kapgan's brutality during the last years of his rule returned and submitted to the new Kagan. With increased manpower, Bilge was able to subdue Bazmil Turks, the Kumoji, and the Khitan. Another factor in the strength of the Göktürks was the restructuring of the army. The most successful part of the army consisted of mounted archers. The best archers were allowed to wear white falcon feathers on their helmets. They wore armor made of hard leather and metal. Bilge Khan also recruited mercenaries from other nations so that non-Turks such as Mongols, Tanguts, and numerous Chinese fought in his ranks. He also organized the campaign against the Uyghurs, the Dokuzos, and subjugated the Karluks in the west, who had not recognized Bilge's accession to the throne. He now had to militarily defeat the Kyrgyz and all other tribes of the empire in order to impose his rule. In the winter of 720, a joint attack of the Bazmils, Kumoji and Khitan with the Chinese against the Göktürks was being planned, but Tonyukuk learned of it in time, and Bilge Khan destroyed the Bazmils. The Tang army could not use bows and arrows because of the cold climatic conditions, and their skins were cracked by the cold, so they had to retreat too. According to his own inscription, Bilge Khagan destroyed 17,000 on the first day of the war and completely destroyed the enemy infantry armies on the second day. He was busy punishing the other tribes until the spring of 722. These punitive expeditions continued for the next 12 years until the death of Bilge Khan. In fact, the Second Göktürk Empire is much more marked by internal problems than the first. This time, it was not the Ashina dynasty that divided and fought each other in the west and east. Instead, there was an estrangement between the Ashina, the core of the empire, and all other tribes. In the interregnum era between 630 and 681, there had been no Khagan. This means that the Turkic and non-Turkic tribes and federations were not united under one banner. There was no one to end quarrels among them. At the same time, there was no one who could carry out large-scale raids into the territories of their settled neighbors. At the same time that the Begs, tribal leaders, were struggling to maintain social order, the former Khagans and their descendants were living a comfortable life in China. At least, that was how the Begs perceived the situation, while the Ashina dynasty considered itself resting in hostage.
One thing that to me is fascinating, if you look at the Bilge Khagan and Kultigan inscriptions, it's just a constant list of, oh, this people rebelled and we had to fight them, and then this people rebelled and we had to fight them. It seems like it was very hard to keep that state together. Bilge spent a lot of his time subjugating people that had already been subjugated before. I wrote an article long ago, probably when I was too young. About essentially was that in any kind of iteration state, you have the ruling family and then you have many other groups of people. And those groups of people, just like the Turks in China, were unhappy being part of that system. The people under the Turks in the First and Second Empires are not always happy being part of that system. And so they rebel or try to rebel. And so that's why the Uyghurs are brought down by the Kyrgyz. Kapgan, was killed by a coalition of subordinate tribes who were trying to overthrow him. They were not successful, but Bilge Khagan had to spend most of his life, or much of his life, bringing those people back under his control. And then after his death, things unraveled again very quickly.
Another factor for instability in the empire was the cultural pull from the south. The nomadic peoples could not escape the charms of Chinese cities forever. Back on the steppes, the Göktürks led as hard a life as their ancestors under Buymin and Istemi had as well. Since the Second Göktürk Empire never reached the size of the First Empire, it was also not as wealthy or powerful. It did not have control over the cities in Western Asia. Accordingly, Bilge Khan almost fell to the influence of the Chinese until Tönjükük, shortly before his demise, was able to change his emperor's mind. The master strategist taught the Khagan that, moreover, Buddhism would pacify the people of the empire, but because of this, they would have no fighting power or even will to fight to protect their empire from invasion. So the Turkic tribes of Asia had to continue to be loyal to Tengrism. Instead of building cities, they had to stay in yurts and move around depending on the season. Did they really have to? Tönjükük's words impressively show that he had learned from the mistakes of his ancestors. The political sovereignty of the Turks had to be protected from the other seductions of other cultures. On the other hand, the Göktürk Empire was going down anyway, only 12 years after Bilge Khan's death. In the meantime, his brother Kultegin had also died. The Second Göktürk Khaganate fell in 745. A coalition of Bazmils, Uyghurs, and Chinese had invaded the last Khagan, killed his followers, and defeated the Ashina dynasty. This time, there would be no Ashina comeback. The Second Göktürk Empire was also the last, and its downfall ushered in perhaps the greatest wave of migration in all of Turkic history. The already mentioned states of the Khazars, Turkshahi, Tokhara Yabgus received new Turkic tribes who had fled from the east. 24 Turkic tribes settled in the Aral Sea in 750 and became known as the Oghuz Turks. from these tribes over the course of centuries, new Turkic dynasties descended, those of the Ottomans, Seljuks, Akkoyunlu, and Pechenek. The Uyghurs succeeded the Gökturks, but after only 2 decades, they discarded the old Turkic script. Their rulers converted from Tengriism to Manichaeism. Meanwhile, the Turco-Sogdian general An Lushan instigated a great rebellion against the Tang dynasty and had called the Sogdians and Turks for help. But instead of helping, the Turkic Uyghurs remained passive and at the last moment placed themselves protectively in front of their Chinese neighbors. With the Uyghur help, the An Lushan rebellion, which had been a glimmer of hope for the nomadic tribes of Eurasia, was forcibly ended. The Uyghurs had made exactly the mistake Tonyukuk had warned against. They too were replaced anyway, this time by the Kyrgyz in 840, who again adopted the old Turkic script and remained Tengriist. Their khaganate lasted longer, but they remained nomads throughout. The downfall of the Gökturks might have been unstoppable. From Iltutmish to Bilge Khan, the Ashina dynasty had done everything to lead the Turkic peoples to freedom and preserve their political independence. But it was precisely the other tribes that did not cooperate. This was one of the reasons why the empire disintegrated so quickly. The Turks were betrayed by other Turks, and these in turn were deposed by other Turks. At that moment, the Turks' greatest enemy was the Turk. But the fall of the Gökturks was not the end of Turkic history. On the contrary, now that the Middle Ages had set in, Turkic civilization was only beginning to take off. Turkic and Turkish dynasties rose to power in all regions of Eurasia and later even in the Middle East, India, North Africa, and Anatolia. They developed in different ways. Some remained nomadic, others became sedentary, some converted to Judaism or Islam, others even remained Tengriists. But they all had one thing in common: the legacy of the Gökturks. Even the legendary Genghis Khan started his world domination tour from where the Gökturks had ruled in the past, the Orkhon Valley. We have described the history of the Gökturks in detail in 3 films and in 2 books, the second of which is to be released in 2023. We highlighted their most glorious days, but also analyzed their mistakes. Now, the time has come to tell the stories of their heirs.